Good morning. Or perhaps it's not morning where you are. I can see that you're beaming in, you're watching here from all four corners of the globe. Can you have four corners of the globe? Four corners of the map, all points of the globe. So maybe it's not morning where you are. Maybe you're just getting out of bed. Maybe you're watching the dawn break, or maybe it's the other end of the day. Maybe you're very tired after a long day at work and you've just got in. Maybe it's the middle of the day where you are. I don't know what time it is where you are. 7 a.m. in Brazil, I see. Yes, very early. Well done for getting up so early. Lunchtime in Poland, always a good time. Somebody from Adrian from Somerset, and it's, well, the same time as it is here, because here in the east of England, where I am broadcasting from, it is actually a lovely spring morning. It's the middle of the morning. What's a good time to tell a story, do you think? When's the best time to tell a story? Late at night, you're sitting around a fireplace, maybe out in the woods around a campfire, always a good time for stories. Maybe on a Friday afternoon. When I was a small boy, 150 years ago, when I was at primary school, my teacher always had story time, last thing on a Friday, and it was something we'd all look forward to. We'd put our desks away and we'd all sit cross-legged in a circle on the floor while our teacher read or told us a story. And now when I'm teaching, if I have a class last slot on a Friday, which is the end of the working week usually here in Britain, I always like to reserve Friday afternoon as story time, that moment when everybody's just coming down, just starting to relax a little bit, thinking about different things. Late at nights, early in the morning. It's 11 o'clock in the morning here, as I said, middle of the morning. Is that a good time to tell a story? Where are you? Where are you at 11 o'clock in the morning? It might be in the working day for most of you. You might be in a classroom, or it might just fit in with your morning break. Maybe 11 o'clock in the morning is the time where you might just nip out to a cafe to grab a coffee, meet up with a friend, and your friend starts telling you about what they did this weekend, what happened. They might tell you a bit of gossip, an anecdote, a joke. All of these things are stories. They might tell you what happened in a football match they watched, the narrative of what went on. All these things are stories. Stories are everywhere. Stories can come from anywhere, even though they are often in different containers. Whether it's a proper story or a joke or an anecdote or a piece of gossip, all of these things have their own distinct linguistic features, and they're all about extended speaking and extended listening, and they always involve the teller at the centre, but engaging the listeners, the collaborative activities. I love stories. I think most of us do, in one form or another, whether we're good readers or not. Is bed made out of books? Maybe it's made out of stories. That's another good time to tell a story, isn't it? Or to read a story when you're tucked up in bed at night. Narratives, after all, are what we find and what we use to make sense of the world around us and to make sense of ourselves. We tell the stories of who we are and who we were. Everyone, wherever they're from, has their stories. Stories might be floating, almost dreamlike, through a city street like this. Stories are what we use to build houses around us, to construct and interpret and understand where we live. Stories can be told down a telephone, filling up an old-fashioned telephone box, and stories can be found by chance wherever you happen to be. Stories come from everywhere, all over the world. Lots of different sources. Stories can protect us. Stories can drive around a city like we're in an armoured car full of stories. Stories can build buildings. Stories shore up who we are. Stories are our foundations. And stories are also a portal, a doorway, a way out of ourselves and into being someone or somewhere else. Like this. Here's a portal, a doorway from one lot of stories into some more stories, because that's often where stories take us, into other stories. I'm not going to tell a story today. I think stories are best told when people are face to face, when there's a group of you, when there's that interaction. Even if there's only one teller, one guide, one person walking you through the story and the others are listening, storytelling is always a collaborative activity. Stories are not only about talking, stories are also about listening, like this young man here who's listening very, very carefully. I hope he can hear okay. When I tell stories, it's me that's leading the story, but I always ask my listeners to join in, to collaborate, to describe characters, objects, places. I might know the routes, but my listeners, my fellow story makers, fill in the details. So I'm not going to tell a story today, not exactly anyhow. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk through the process of telling a story. I'm going to tell a story about telling a story, if you like. So, have we started yet? How are we starting? Where do we start? Where do stories start? At the beginning, of course. To begin at the beginning, as a Welsh poet once wrote. Is the beginning always the best place to start a story? Some stories can start in the middle, where the action is already going on around us, throwing us into the middle of the river as it's rushing around. Can some stories start at the end, with the characters thinking about what has happened to them? In some ways, if we tell a story in the past tense, all stories start at their end. Stories are about reflecting on what has happened to us. Where there are lots of places where a story can start, millions. Stories can start with somebody finding something, or somebody losing something. Stories can start with somebody waking up in the morning, or with somebody going to sleep at night. When we go into that land of stories that might be dreams. Stories can start when you meet someone for the first time. Stories can start when somebody leaves. Stories can start with an arrival. And stories can also start with a departure. So where is our first question? Where is one of the key questions we need to think of when we're telling a story? Where are we? This is one of the questions, one of the many questions we need when telling a story, to which there are no right or wrong answers. Where are we? We could be in the middle of a deep, dark forest. That's always a good place for a story to start. We could be on a train, maybe. Is it a long-distance international intercity train, or the metro, the subway in a crowded city? Are we on a mountainside somewhere, in a desert, on a ship in the middle of the sea? Are we in the middle of a big, big city? Are we in a classroom? There are lots of stories happening in a classroom, as I'm sure most of you know. Are we inside? Are we outside? Are we in a bar, a cafe, or a restaurant? Or are we in a house? If we're in a house, what kind of a house is it? A small flat or a massive mansion? What's the weather like? What time is it? Day or night? Dawn or dusk? Or a bright midday? Where? Think of a place. I'd like you to imagine a place. Think where the story starts. Now, if I'm doing this kind of activity with a class, what I'll do at this point is put my students in twos and ask them to tell each other the place that they are imagining. Inside, outside, big city, small town, sea, desert, mountain, wherever they are, just very simply to describe it to each other. We are in our imagination, as Anna says, exactly. That way, if you get your students to talk to each other, to describe and answer the simple question where, you will start generating lots and lots of stories in your classroom. Where? That's our first question. And after where, we're on to our next question, which is who? All stories need characters in them. They need people in them. Well, maybe not necessarily people, but they need protagonists. They need action. All stories need some kind of conflict for the drama to turn on a choice, a decision, a bargain, or a deal. And who is it that enacts these things? Who is in this story? Is your story going to be a kind of folk tale story? In folk tales, characters tend to be very simple, very one-dimensional, very flat. They are quite simply a king, a queen, a prince, a princess, a rich man, a poor man. They have no depth in some ways. They are simply people who do things or to whom things happen. Or perhaps your story will be different. Perhaps your story is drawing from a tradition of realism, and the characters in your story will be fully three-dimensional, living, breathing, real people who could quite easily be amongst us, who could walk off the page or out of the story like real human beings. When you tell stories, or when you read stories, or when you listen to stories, what kind of characters do you like? Do you like to identify with the characters? Do you like to be among people who are similar to you, of the same age, the same background, do the same jobs, perhaps people who you recognize, people who you think you would understand, people who are like you? Or perhaps you would choose to have stories in which people are very, very different to you. People about whom you know nothing. People about whom you will learn. People who may react or act very, very differently as to how you would. Who are our characters? A man, a woman, a child. Perhaps it's an animal. There are lots of stories involving animals. Stories about cats, monkeys, lions, fish. Perhaps our characters or our tellers are not necessarily humans or animals. Perhaps our narrators could be objects. A bunch of keys, perhaps. What are these keys to? Where might they lead us? A coin. Imagine where this coin has been. How many hands it has passed through? How many stories would this coin have to tell? Lots of things can tell those stories. Where? Who? When we're telling stories, it's all about the questions. Where and who are the ones to start with. And then we ask all the other questions. What, when, why, how, what, if. These are all the questions they answer that will help us to find the path through the labyrinth, the maze, the garden of forking paths that a story is. Now then, our story The story I'm going to talk you through this morning, the story I'm talking about telling, the story I'm telling you about telling, the story I'm walking you slowly through, the story which is just the skeleton of the story of whose bones I am going to show you, a story which I hope you will take away and change and adapt and retell and use in your circumstances. This story begins with a question: where? I'm not going to tell you where. Think of your place. And our next question: who? Now then, for this story to work, I'm going to have to tell you who. And I'm going to tell you that this story begins with a man. It's as simple as that. You decide. Is he an old man, a young man, a rich man, a poor man, a fat man, a thin man? What kind of a man is he? Does he have a big grey beard? Does he have a nice little moustache? Does he wear a fancy hat? I don't know. It's up to you. Think about who the man is in your story. Now then, this man, now you've got him. It begins with this man coming home. I imagine that he's coming home from a day at work. More than that, I'm not going to tell you. Is he walking through city streets? Has he had to take a crowded bus home? Has he sat on an overheated metro train? Is he walking through a snowy field? Is it dark? Is it late at night as he walks home? Imagine this man coming home from work, I think. So he gets home. And as he gets home, what does he do? Does he just open the door? Does he need a key to get in? Does he knock and wait for somebody to answer the door for him? What's his home like? Is it a massive big house? Is it a tiny little hut? Does he live in a flat? Where is home? What does he do? I think, I'm going to tell you, he knocks on the door. And the door opens and he walks in. He's very familiar with this place because it is, after all, home. Now then, of course, there is somebody there to let him in. There is somebody else in this story. We'll get to that person in a second, but I want you to think for a minute. This man, he's just got in from work, wherever he is. How do you feel when you get in from work? Are you really tired? Do you just want to stretch out, sit on the sofa, watch TV? Or are you full of energy from the day, really happy to be back at home, waiting to tell everybody at home what's happened to you that day? Do you make yourself a cup of tea? Do you start on something to eat? Maybe you're starving, hungry. How do you feel when you get in from work, and what do you want to do? I imagine our man, our character, who's just got in from work. And this is what he does. I think in our story, I imagine this man being quite tired. He's had a busy day, a long day. And he sits down and he looks at our other who, the second person in this story. Now, the second person in this story is a woman. Now, I have to explain here that this story that I'm telling you about telling, that I'm talking you through, this story is a very old story. It's a story which is based on a traditional way. So we have the man coming in from work and the woman at home waiting for him. A traditional setup. In your story, in your lives, it may be very, very different. It might be the complete opposite. But for now, let's stick with that. The man comes in from work. There's a woman there waiting for him. A woman. Who is this woman at home? Is it his wife? His mother? His daughter? His sister? Have a think. Who is she? And again, this woman, who is she? Is she old, tall, short, happy, sad? What kind of a person is she? And what's the relationship between them? Here's a good thing. when we're telling stories, we can put in lots of nice little pieces of vocabulary here and there. If we're thinking about this man and this woman, we can just ask our students to think about the relationship between them and ask them, do they get on well with each other? Do they rub along? Do they have their ups and downs? Have they had any rocky patches? Have a think. Have a think who this man is, who this woman is, what the relationship is between them, where they are, how the man feels. And you're already building up your story. So the man sighs. I think he sits down, has a stretch. Maybe he's tired, maybe he's excited. And he sits down, and to the woman, who I imagine in my version of the story, this woman is his wife. And he sits down as he gets in from work, and he starts to tell her a story. And now we're there. Now we're into the labyrinth, the hall of mirrors, the Russian dolls. We've got a story within a story. I'm telling you a story about a man telling a story. Stories themselves can contain hundreds of stories. Sometimes it can get confusing. But don't worry. The story that this man is going to tell is a very simple story. It's a very typical story. He sits down and he turns around and he says to his wife, "You'll never guess who I met today," he says. And I say, he says. Is he doing it now? When we tell a story, what tense do we tell it in? Those of us who are teachers, most of us, I expect, are used to doing lots of lovely work on narrative tenses. There's the unit in the course book, isn't there? Narrative tenses, when we get to practice all those lovely past perfect and past perfect condition, past perfect continuous forms. We think these are our narrative tenses. These are what we use when we're telling a story. But the fact is, if you think about it, when we tell stories, we don't often use those tenses, unless, of course, we want to be very literary, which can be good in its way. But most of the time, when we tell a story, we use the present simple tense. Sometimes a story, of course, can be in the past simple tense. But those two tenses, simple by name and simple because they are, these are the tenses we use when we're telling a story. And usually when I tell a story, I tell it in the present. I think it can help to engage listeners more, to make them feel as though they're there, as though they're with me, as we are building this story together. So as if this story is happening now. The man sits down after his long day at work, turns to his wife, stretches, and he says, "You'll never guess who I met today. Just now, on the way home from work." Now this man telling the story has his listener, of course. He has this woman, I imagine his wife, who's listening. How do you think she feels when the man sits down and starts to tell his story? Is she interested? Is she excited? Does she want to hear what he's got to say? Or is she bored, fed up? She's busy with other things. She's got her own things that she wants to tell him, maybe. Is she used to this? Does this man always come in and tell stories about his day? Or is it a surprise? Perhaps this is something very unusual, that our man has met somebody. Have a think. And again, "You'll never guess who I met today," he says. I think at this point the woman has to engage. She has to respond. She's a good listener after all, and a good listener means asking questions. So she turns to him and says, "Well, I have no idea. Go on, surprise me. Who did you meet today?" "Well," says the man, "as I was coming home from work, I met old who?" Now we come to another question that we have to answer. It's another who question, or a what, perhaps. So far, We've got our two characters, our man coming home from work, our woman waiting for him. We haven't given them names. We've just called them man and woman. If you're working with a group, you can ask your group to think of names for the characters. For now, for the purposes of this, our two characters can stay just being man and woman, but our third person, the person the man has met on his way home from work, needs a name. Think of a name for this man. Well, I've got a name for him. This man is called Chichikov. It's called Chichikov for no other reason than it's a name I once heard, and I thought it was a good name. I thought I liked the sound of it. So, here he is. Our man gets in from work, sits on the sofa, says to his wife, you'll never guess who I met coming home from work today. And his wife says, go on, tell me, who did you run into on the way home from work today? And the man says, I met old Chichikov. What does the woman do at this point? How does she respond? Well, at this point, I have to tell you, at this point, when the man says, old Chichikov, the woman is amazed, astounded. She is shocked. She is horrified. Why do you think that might be? The man says a simple story. He was coming home from work, he ran into old Chichikov. But his wife is horrified by this. She is shocked, she is astounded. Her eyes grow. Old Chichikov, she says. Yes, says the man, old Chichikov, you remember old Chichikov? And she says, yes, I do remember old Chichikov. But that can't be. You can't possibly have met old Chichikov on the way home from work. And the man says, what do you mean? I ran into him. He was there, large as life, same as he ever was. Looking a bit thin, perhaps, looking a bit pale, but it was old Chichikov, I'm sure of it. And the woman looks even more worried, even more astounded. No, she says, you can't have met old Chichikov, because exactly a year ago today, old Chichikov died. What do you mean, says the man? What are you talking about? I don't remember that. Oh, you never remember anything, says his wife. You never remember? Come on, there was a funeral, the whole town was there. Where were you? How come you don't remember it? Old Chichikov, he's dead and gone. And the man says, well, if old Chichikov is dead and gone, then who was the man I met on my way home from work? I don't believe he's dead and gone, because not only did I run into old Chichikov and say hello to him, I invited him for dinner. You did what? Says his wife. I invited him for dinner. He's an old guy. I think he's on his own. I haven't seen him for ages. It seemed like a friendly thing to do. He was looking a bit thin. He was looking a bit pale. I thought he could do with a good meal, one of those delicious meals that you cook. Yeah, I invited him for dinner. You invited old Chichikov for dinner? Asks his wife. Yes, I did, says the man. And what's more, he said he would come to dinner. Let's take a step back a second. Here's our story so far. What we've got here are the bones of the story, the skeleton of the story. When I tell stories, when I create stories, I usually have something like this, either written down, or if it's a story I know, I don't need to have it written down because it's already in my head. This is a very simple plan of the story. Here, we've got the nodes, or the knots of the story, the things that have to happen to make it a story. As long as these things happen, anything else can be invented. Our where, our who, our why, our what. All of those are details that you and your students, your listeners, the storytellees can join in with. Here it is. A returns home, he tells B he's met C, B is horrified, B tells A that's impossible, that C is dead. A says this is impossible, as C is invited C to dinner. Those are the simple bones of our story so far. These are very useful things to have, story skeletons. I have another one here. I don't know if you can see that, I hope so. This is a skeleton, the bones, the key of another quite well-known story. Two young people from opposite, we have our who, two young people, they're from opposite social classes or groups, different faiths, one rich, one poor maybe. They meet, they fall in love, but because of their difference they have to meet in secret, and this story has a tragic ending. Does anybody know what this story is? If you know, have a type. Type in your answers if anybody knows what the story is. Well, let me tell you, this story could be Shakespeare. This is the story. These are the bones of the story of Romeo and Juliet. But also, this is also the story of a very famous film. This is the story of Titanic. You must remember that film, very famous film, Leonardo DiCaprio, Kate Winslet. Exactly the same story. It has the same bones, but the contexts are completely different. Let's try another one. Here are the bones of another famous story. Old king dies. He's been killed by an evil uncle, the uncle of a young prince who discovers the truth about what happened. The young prince runs away from this difficult situation, then grows up and has to return to resolve the situation. Anybody know what this story is? You might recognize this story as being Shakespeare. Again, Shakespeare's great for stories. This is the story of Hamlet, Shakespeare's great tragedy. But it is also the story of a Disney movie, The Lion King. Exactly the same story. The bones of the story are the same. The context is completely different. Once you've got the bones of a story, you can change it so anything can happen. Let's go back to our original story. A man returning home from work tells his wife he's met old Chichikov. His wife is horrified. You can't have met old Chichikov because old Chichikov died a year ago today. Well, how is that then? Because I invited old Chichikov to dinner. And with that, there is a knock at the door. Where the stories end. I've said it before, but it's worth saying again. I think the best stories might stop, but they never end. The best stories stay there in our minds, leading us back to them, back through that labyrinth, back through that maze, back through all those pathways, keeping us thinking and asking and reflecting and remembering again and again. Some stories end with a twist in the tale, a shock, a sudden surprise ending. Other stories end with an epiphany, a moment when the character understands everything. Some stories, however, end just like that. And that's where this story will end for today. I've told this story with classes, and if you time it just right, you can tell this story. So it's coming up to the end of the lesson, and you can end just at the last minute of the lesson as the bell rings. Your students are usually ready to go with that knock on the door, and for once you might be surprised that your students want to stay in the classroom. They want to have more English. They want to keep on because they have to know what happens next. For those of you interested, we imagined our man, our woman, our situation. This is how I imagined the story, probably because this story, which is a Central or East European story from the Jewish tradition. There are lots of versions of this story, but I first came across this story in a film, a really good film. We talked before about books. Books are usual containers of stories, but films are also very good containers of stories. This film was a film called A Serious Man, made by the Coen brothers, and the film begins by telling this story. And here it is. Here's the picture you can see. It's the moment when there is that knock at the door. Now, I like to leave the story there, but in the film, if you go and watch it, you'll find out the story does continue. But for now, I'm going to leave you with that knock at the door, and this story ends right here. Thank you very much. If anybody's got any questions, fire away. Type in questions, anything you want to ask, let me know.
As Chris said, everyone, if there's any questions after that, then please use the time now to ask. We have one from Esther, Chris. Yeah.
Yep. Esther says, how long should a story last, in your opinion? And that is a very good question. It's one of those how long is a piece of string questions. I've got some stories that take about 2 minutes to tell. I've got other stories which can go on for an hour. How long should a story last? When you're telling a story, it depends entirely on where you are and who you are with. Sometimes you can use a storytelling activity just to fill in those few minutes at the end of a class. Sometimes you can base a whole lesson or series of lessons around it. It depends on the level of your students. It depends on how they're feeling, if they're very energetic or if they're very quiet, what mood you manage to generate in the classroom. So I think there is no right or wrong answer to that question. It depends entirely on your students, on your context, how you're feeling, your own repertoire of stories, how quickly you want to tell the story, how much you want to stretch it out. Kate says, how can we make a story interesting? Well, that's a very good question. Make a story interesting by engaging your listeners, getting them to contribute, finding a story which you as the teller or as the teacher, whatever your role is, that you like. I think if it's a story that you like, you will be able to transmit your enthusiasm for the story. I've told stories from all over the world to groups of, I've worked with adults mostly, but a lot with teenagers, and sometimes people think, oh no, that's a Victorian story, teenagers aren't going to be interested in that. But if you can engage them, I think if it's a story that you like and it's a good story, that makes it interesting. Is there somebody asked, is there a resource of these bones? Well, the resource is any stories you've ever come across. You can make yourself a resource. There's an old book, but a very good book about using stories in the language classroom by Mario Rinvolucri. It's called Once Upon a Time, I think. It's quite an old book, but that's got quite a lot of story bones in it. That's good. I'm missing some of these questions too, excuse me. If you see your students are getting bored with the story, what will you do? Good question. Yep. Speed it up. Change the focus. Engage them more. Stop at certain points and ask them to imagine what's going to happen in the story. Think about yourself, your own body, your own projection, your own voice. Eye contact is really important. That's why I said I like telling stories to people, and what I'm finding is a bit unusual because I can't make eye contact with you all. I'm just looking into a camera. Things like that. Yep. Pace, tone, context, body language, use of realia or something. Stop and get them to predict. Suggests Adrian. Yep, absolutely, all the time. That garden of forking paths, all the pathways, which way are we going to go? The sense that they are helping to build the story, to create the story. Every time you tell a story, it's the first time. I've told stories dozens and dozens of times, and every time you tell them, it's always slightly different, depending on who's listening and what they're bringing to the story. Any other questions, suggestions? I hope I didn't miss anybody's. One more, anybody?
Yeah, we've got time for one more, and then we'll have to say goodbye to Chris for today. So let's make it a good one. Chris, you pick one from the chat box that we can use.
Oh, there are lots of stories. Chain storytelling is great, Marina. The name of, I suggest the name of the book. Well, I didn't find a story in a book. It was from a film. I think somebody pointed out it was. The film is called The Serious Man by the Coen brothers. But since then, I've done some research and I found out there are versions of this story spread far and wide. I don't know that they're in a book. Somebody asked me what my favourite story was, which is an impossible question to answer because I've got hundreds of favourite stories. I don't have one in particular. Stories are always good, so please take this story, any other story, and go and use it. Go and use it in your context and see what it turns into. Thank you very much, everybody. Do keep the discussion
Thank you, Chris.
going.
Some lovely comments coming in there. It looks like people have really enjoyed the session.
Great.
So thank you to you once again for being here with us today. And do remember, guys, it's all been recorded, so you can catch that later too and share it with your colleagues. Okay, so Chris, we're going to have to say goodbye to you now. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for coming.
Thank you all.
Let's all say bye to Chris now, from all four corners of the map.
Bye all. Thank you.
Bye, Chris. Bye. Okay, so it seems that you all enjoyed that one.
Hi, everybody. It's really lovely. I wish I could see you too, but obviously I can't. So yeah, this webinar, as you will have gathered, is about storytelling at work. And some of the areas that we're going to explore fairly briefly in the next 40 minutes or so are why it's important to tell stories at work. What do they add to our impact and to our ways of communicating with people? How storytelling in itself can help your students gain confidence in speaking up at work, and how to create and tell stories together as a group and as individuals. And there'll be some activities suggested for that. When I'm glancing aside on the screen, that's my notes I'm looking at. So it's not that I'm not concentrating. Okay, so I'm going to just read you a very short story and see if you recognize it. It's about a woman named Anne Nixon Cooper. She's a lot like the millions of others who stood in line to make their voice heard in this election, except for one thing. Anne Nixon Cooper is 106 years old. She was born just a generation past slavery, a time when there were no cars on the road or planes in the sky, when someone like her couldn't vote for two reasons, because she was a woman and because of the color of her skin. And tonight, I think about all that she's seen throughout her century in America, the heartache and the hope, the struggle and the progress, the times when we were told that we can't, and the people who pressed on with that American creed, yes, we can. So I'm wondering if anybody recognizes that. And if you didn't, it was from Barack Obama's electoral victory speech in 2008. And his speechwriter, John Favreau, said, "The best way to connect with people is through stories that are important to people's lives." So what is storytelling? Storytelling, that was me pausing to shift the slides on. Storytelling is the act of sharing a tale or a series of events. We do it all the time. We grow up with stories. And the reason that story was so powerful for Obama at that moment was clearly that it was connecting up a struggle that had been brought to fruition, and that is such a potent theme in work stories. When we want to persuade people to think our way, or when we want to be more visible at work, or when we want to capture people's imagination, a lot of it is about the point that we started and the point that we've arrived at. That's the journey. So I'm going to invite you just for a moment to think about a story that was important to you when you were growing up, and to think about what you remember about it, and to think about how that resonates to you now as an adult. So we're going to ask you to respond to that. Do it in your own time, and we'll gather some ideas in a little while. But could you ever think about that? Which stories were important to you? Why do you remember them? Why are they meaningful to you? Okay. So, what else is storytelling? According to the National Storytelling Network, storytelling is the active and interactive art of using words and actions to reveal the elements and images of a story while encouraging the listener's imagination. I said that really badly. I'm going to say it all over again. Storytelling is the interactive art of using words and actions to reveal the elements and images of a story while encouraging the listener's imagination. So it's not just about the story, is it? It's about the relationship that we create when we're telling the story, and the way that we convey that story through our bodies and our voices. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But the point here is that storytelling is interactive. It creates a connection between the storyteller and the listeners. And so there are so many ways that we can give out information, that we can convey information, but speaking is the one that creates relationship. The responses of the listeners will affect the delivery of our story and the pace and the language and the moods of it. So we have so many opportunities to move people in different ways when we tell stories. So why do it at work? For that very reason. I don't know if you've read any of Philip Pullman's books. He wrote The Dark Materials, and he's a wonderful storyteller himself. And as you can see here, he said, after nourishment, shelter and companionship, stories are the thing we need most in the world. Well, I think that's really interesting. And I think that part of what he's talking about there is our primal instinct to tell and hear stories. And the human mind, in its attempt to make sense of life, to assemble the fragments of life and experience, make stories of them. Stories are what we remember. We're brought up with stories from babyhood, and it's much harder, on the other hand, to remember lists and hard facts and statistics and bullet points. The two things aren't mutually exclusive, by the way. It's fine to give out facts and statistics if you're trying to get a message across at work, but not on its own. And there's a very interesting book by Mark Turner called The Literary Mind. He's a cognitive scientist, and he argues that stories are the building blocks of human thought, the absolute necessities of life. Because stories and parables, he says, are the means by which the brain works. He says story is a basic principle of mind. So, in other words, he argues that we think in terms of stories. So, for instance, we learn as babies that if we throw our toys out of the pram, then the toy disappears. And then somebody, possibly a parent, will probably come and pick it up. And if we're lucky, we'll get a kiss. And maybe they'll comfort us. And if we throw our cereal on the floor, the parent might make different kinds of noises, but they'll probably still turn up and do something about it. Something happens. There's an action and there's a consequence. And that's a story. And it's a basic understanding of cause and effect by which we make sense of the world. And we continue to make stories of our experience all through our lives. So, what does that add to presentations or public speaking? What does it add to our experience at work? Well, this quote is from an article by Stephen Denning, who talks a lot about leadership and storytelling in business, and it's an article that was in Forbes. And again, I'll read the quote. Narrative is the natural instrument of change because it draws on the active, living participation of individuals. It dwells in the experience of the people who act, think, talk, discuss, chat, joke, complain, dream, agonize, and exult together. So why tell stories and speeches? Because they make us and our content more interesting, and they can steer the audience to where we want them to pay attention. But it's not just about getting our message across. Just keep remembering it's about creating connection. So stories are always interesting. They help people remember what we say, and they're a good way to convey whatever we want to convey with emotion. And keep remembering this is about relationship. And if we want to be people at work, and we want people to remember what we want them to remember, we need to be memorable and we need to be visible. And people need to understand that we're a real human being doing the talking and not just a series of PowerPoint slides. So the other brilliant thing, apart from being memorable, is that if you're telling stories, you don't have to be the expert. And I bet you're not always the person who knows most in the room at work. Maybe you are. I'm certainly not. And so stories free us up to convey things through our own experience and through our own creative, imaginative talents that mean that we don't have to know more. And that's a really great place to be. And we're going to talk more about confidence in a little while, but I think, again, really, that's a really important point. So, okay, so most people do organize their talks in lists of information. Most of my clients start off like that. Sometimes they even start with a PowerPoint deck and try and weave a presentation around that, which I wouldn't recommend as a starting point. And that might be 5 reasons to invest in my product, or 5 minutes to buy something, or 5 minutes to change, 5 reasons to change that policy. But as we said, the human mind isn't constructed to remember lists very well, and they're not how we're moved to change. Lists don't do it on their own. But if you think about, for instance, the story of Romeo and Juliet. I don't know who knows the story of Romeo and Juliet, or who's maybe seen the play or heard it. But if you do, I bet you remember it. You remember the young lovers and the twists of fate and the ache of the building tragedy and that big story and the little tiny stories that line the journey of those 2 young people. So more of that in a little while. But let's say in a business context, my team have developed a new product. It's a stroke drug. In other words, something that works well for recovery in stroke patients. And I want you to invest in that commercial development of that product. So I could say my key messages are things like this. Okay, it has a potential 45% market share in the UK, and I've got charts to show the corresponding potential growth in Europe. And it uses tetraparticle chemistry with microdynamically enabled ingredients, and 22% of pilot patients improved by symptoms by 14% in an 18-month period, and so on and so on. And I'm not saying these facts won't interest you on their own, but they're not potent, are they, as a list? They won't fire up your feelings or your imagination or your care for the potential benefits of this drug. So I might also tell you a story, beginning with my friends. My wonderful friend whose vibrant life suffered badly when she had a stroke in her 50s, and the tough time she had and her partial recovery. And I'm going to tell you about her passion for reading and singing in choirs and writing, and how badly that was affected by her stroke and her worry for the future. And I might tell you about other patients that I met who, in the course of the pilot trial, had real benefits from this drug and whose lives have been turned around by regaining their mobility again, and how I wish it had been available for my friend at that point. And so I engage you in the drama by being part of the challenge of getting this to a successful conclusion, because I need help from you to get this to market. You and I are now creating a relationship at that point. You're part of it. You're part of the story. Okay, so what kinds of stories? Well, stories are all around us. Each of us has a story to tell, and in fact some would argue that life experience is one pretty huge story made up of thousands of smaller stories. And in context of your speaking at work, the big story is the driving message, okay, the overarching narrative, the place you want us to get to. And the small stories are the anecdotes and images that bring this to life within each chapter. The point is, look in your own life and outside for stories to use. Are we okay so far? Let's just let me know if you're following me. How's it going? Because we're going to move on to students gaining confidence in a moment, but is all this making sense? Yeah? Okay. If you want me to pause at any point, we'll have questions at the end, but if there's anything that you urgently want to know along the way, just let us know and we'll try and address it. Okay, so moving on for the moment. Okay, so yeah, building confidence in telling stories and through telling stories. That is our next topic. So I think that storytelling builds confidence because it allows us to tap into the kind of creativity and curiosity we had as children. It taps into our instinctive, learnt ability to listen to and tell stories, but it's also back to we don't have to be the expert. We don't have to get it right in quite the same way, and I think that's very liberating. And as we go through school and into work, the emphasis often is on getting it right, and creativity often takes a back seat, which can really stunt adult learning and dent confidence. And in a right-wrong view of the world, the willingness to take risks and expand can be severely curtailed. So, for instance, when we learn to ride a bike, okay, we become a bike reader through taking risks and making mistakes and sometimes falling off until we don't anymore. And so playfulness can help us to get on and learn to ride that bike, to tell those stories, because it helps us relax and come to life and to be truly present and engaged. And so there are two things here. One is that the very act of playing with stories encourages our confidence in ourselves, but it also, in telling stories, we're more truly present and engaged with ourselves and with our audience, and that is massively confidence-building activity. It allows freedom within structure, so we can use the structure as much as we need to until we become freer with telling our own stories and improvising and being spontaneous. And so we have a safe base from which to experiment and to be more ourselves. And the other thing is that as we share our stories, we share ourselves with others. We build trust in others. And if we share our stories, let's say with our groups in the class, or indeed take them into our work environment, we build our repertoire, and we start to recognize our shining moments and our accomplishments, and we're more likely to have the confidence to show who we really are and take that sense of worth into work. And the result is more ease, more individuality, and a more confident presence all round. And improvising stories means that we need to let go, we need to be in the moment, we need to listen to each other and accept and build on offers, and they're all great qualities for our personal impact at work. And of course, how we tell them also counts for a lot, and we'll explore some delivery skills in a little while, practical ways of looking and sounding confident while speaking. Again, let me know if there's anything that's puzzling or anything that you want to say. So I want to come back to that question now, just for a moment, about which stories you remember for yourselves from your formative years, and in what way they resonate now. Has anybody got any thoughts about that? And we can always come back to that in Q&A if you want to. Okay. So for me, most of the stories that I really remember from my childhood were about young people being adventurous. And I know that as an adult, that is enormously meaningful to me, that it's given me thoughts about ways of being courageous in the world and ways of taking risks and ways that sometimes instinct is important as well as intellect. And the stories that I read have very, very much played into the way that I've approached my life and my work as a grown-up. So again, just plugging that in. This is important. What do our stories mean? What is their purpose? Because when we're going to tell stories at work, the first thing that we need to think about is, what's the purpose? Okay, we'll come back to that too. Yup. So Obama, of course, used many stories in his speeches, and one way to start seeing stories and exploring structure is, of course, to look at stories within famous speeches, and both literary and political, and there's rich, rich material out there. Martin Luther King, we have up there, Churchill, Gandhi. I would also say Shakespeare, Emily Pankhurst, Hillary Clinton. We can look for stories within books, within public speeches, within films. And so a fun way to start looking at structure can be to see how concisely we can summarize the plot lines of books and films. And I'm indebted to an article in the Telegraph Online and to a blog on advancedfictionwriting.com for these quick summaries of stories that we probably all know. Lord of the Rings. Frodo and Hobbit pals take magic ring on quest. Gollum tries to steal ring. Wizard Gandalf is nice. Sauron is nasty. Battles. Ring destroyed. War and Peace. Napoleon invades Russia. Russian aristocratic families sent into a tiz. War ensues. French retreat. Russians celebrate. Lots of them marry. Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. A boy wizard begins training and must battle for his life with the Dark Lord who murdered his parents. I think this is a great exercise for students. It's really fun, and it very much focuses one's thinking about the key elements of a story, and therefore the key elements of a story that would relate to any topic at work. And what it does is illustrate how stories flow. You really start to see the sense of the narrative flow, the narrative drive, when you do that exercise. So some more quick thoughts about what makes a good story. Okay, so the basic guidelines for stories at work would be know who your audience is. That's going to affect every story that you build. So every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Sounds obvious, but we often forget that. And at work, as I said before, we need to know what the purpose of telling the story is, to have really clear chapter headings so that the audience stay with us. And those clear chapter headings are probably our key messages. And then to use concrete details and personal experience within those chapters to bring them to life. So stories describe a journey through change. Okay? And back to Obama's speechwriter, the one who incorporated that beautiful story into Obama's victory speech. This is from Jon Favreau. And he gives 4 key pieces of advice for creating stories for speeches or stories for work, his advice goes like this. 1, the story is more important than the words. Now that might sound a bit paradoxical, but what he says is, in my experience, communication too often focuses on finding the right words. Of course words are important at some point in the process, but the first question you have to ask yourself is, what is the story I'm trying to sell? That's essential, and that should be the starting point. 2, keep it simple. Audiences today can only handle so much information before they start losing focus, says Mr. Favreau. Remember that a speech about everything is a speech about nothing. Narrow your story down to the essential point. 3, empathy is key. So this is about the connection and relationship that we're making with our audience. You have to know what the world looks like when you're in their shoes. One of the reasons why Obama's speeches are so successful is because they're written in the language that his audience understands, addressing the issues they are facing. So step into your audience's shoes. And 4, he says, there is no persuasion without inspiration. Tell stories. Okay, so we'll start to think about structure now. And there are many structures that you can use. And one way to start is that you can think of your stories having 3 acts, like Romeo and Juliet. We're going to think about those lovers again now. So, Act 1, the introduction. This is how it was, as it says. This is the context, the everyday life in which the story is set. And we need to know who the central characters are. And so, in the Romeo and Juliet context, there were 2 families, the Capulets and the Montagues, who despised each other, and they fought and feuded. And within those families, there was a son, Romeo, and a daughter, Juliet. And the trigger, the momentous incident that changes everything and sets the character or characters off on a new path, is that these children from the warring families met, and they fell in love. And in fact, they did that rather cheekily, because Romeo invaded a party that Juliet was giving, or Juliet was attendant at, so he shouldn't even have been there. So they fell in love, and we know what they want. They want to be together, and we know what is in the way. Their families hate each other. Okay. So Act 2 of a classic story structure is, we've now embarked on a journey because of the events, and there are challenges and obstacles along the way. And to reach our goal, we need to face difficulty and overcome adversity. And this raises the stakes, because otherwise, yeah, it would be quite a boring story. And there are decisions to be made, and resulting from those decisions, consequences. Many, many consequences. So, within the context of Romeo and Juliet secretly marry, despite the feud between the 2 families. And they now have an investment in creating peace between them, between the Montagues and the Capulets. But Romeo gets involved in 2 fights with deadly consequences. And so the idea of these families being able to make peace is even less likely than before. He's banished. And Juliet's family are about to make her marry someone else. And so the critical choice is, what do we do now? And the critical question is, will Romeo and Juliet live happily ever after? Doesn't look very likely at this point. And other obstacles of miscommunication and misunderstanding, consequences, result in Act 3, the climax and the resolution, where the main event happens and the world of the characters is different from before. And in this case, the climax is the death of both lovers. Tragic death of both of those young people that we've followed through this story throughout. But the new world in which life has changed and something has been achieved and something is different and something has been learned is, in their sorrow, the families finally learned to live in peace with each other. It was a high price they had to pay. And the moral of the story is, feuding is very bad for your health. Think about what the moral of that story might have been if you were creating it. Okay, and feel free to feedback any thoughts you have about that. What do you think that might be the most powerful learning from that story? Okay, so we're going to come up with some activities now for structure and for developing stories spontaneously and flexibly. So I would suggest that, broadly speaking, when we're putting a story, a presentation together, and there's an overarching story within it, that we start with the purpose. That's why the purpose is in the middle of this slide. Okay? And then we know what the beginning and the end are. The beginning and the end, we set up at the beginning the once upon a time moment of the story. What is it we want to achieve with this story? And we know, we as the developers must know what the ending of this story is, the place we're heading for. And so within that, once we know what the purpose is, we can make really clear chapter headings and bridges within them. And then when we have our chapter headings, which might well be our key messages, the consequences that get us from the beginning to the end of the story, then we can start to build the small stories that go alongside each of those chapters, the images and the anecdotes and the metaphors that will enrich and colour that story. Okay, so we start with the purpose, then we have the chapter headings and the narrative, and then we probably fill in the detail. Well, that's not to say that we might not be gathering in the small stories along the way to enrich this major narrative line. And this is a great way of actively testing the narrative line against the rich detail and descriptions as an exercise in pairs. So let's say for this, one place to start is to have your story, your student have their story, the story they want to tell, and to put them with a partner. And whenever the partner wants more detail, which is often what gets missed out when we're telling stories at work, the colour, they say colour. And when they've got enough colour or detail about that part of the story, they say advance. And so the storyteller starts to get some idea of how much detail is interesting to the listener and when the story needs to move on. So colour or advance. And the partner, if you like, is co-creating the story, helping the storyteller tell this story by telling them either to move on or to give them more detail, more description. And in work-based preparations, another great group or pair variation here is to assign one group of people, the facts, the hard facts of the presentation, the key messages, and another group to think about the descriptions of the images and to deliver the material this way between them and then to swap over. Okay, so we've got the story, the main narrative arc, the main drive of the story, and we've got the details and the stories and the colour and the descriptions and the magic of the storytelling. Alrighty. And how small can stories be? Another fun exercise. So Ernest Hemingway, when challenged to tell a story in 6 words, came up with this. For sale. Baby shoes. Never used. Which, I don't know about you, but that evokes so many images and potentialities for me. And again, another activity for students is try and tell a story. Come up with a story in 6 words and see what the listeners take from it. So, in creating and working more on structure and telling stories as a group, this classic story spine very much maps onto the 3 acts that we talked about before. And it's a fantastic place to start in terms of finding your narrative. So once you've explored the advance, the facts in the journey, and the color, the descriptions, to form this into a story, this is a lovely platform. Again, we're never rigid with this. If students want a bit more freedom, then they can play with it, but it's a great place to start. So, how does it correlate? Once upon a time. This is the beginning that establishes the routine. And every day is the context, how things used to be. But one day, the event happens. That triggering event happens. And it has consequences. Because of that, something happens. And then because of that, something else happens. And because of that, something else happens. And then until finally, the climax triggers the resolution of the story. And ever since then, we're in a new world. And we might want to add the moral of the story, what we've learned. And there are many ways in which we can play with this story, Stein, and it's a classic improvisational tool. A lot of the activities, in fact, that I'm suggesting are from the world of improvisation and applied improvisation, and there's a lot of lovely, rich, playful material out there. But the story spine, I would heavily recommend as one place to start. And maybe later, you'd like to map Romeo and Juliet's story onto this structure and really see how that would work. So in using human themes, we're connecting with what's universal in the audience. And there are words like child and family and mother and father and struggle that have enormous resonance for just about everybody. So try and let your audience's imaginations fire. Sorry, I paused there because I could see my picture freezing. I hoped it wasn't me freezing. Imagination fire by giving them enough colour to get their minds working, but not so much detail that they don't have room to make it their own. Okay, more activities for you to use. The journey. So this is another great one. So if you can get your students to describe a well-known route that they take, and the intention is to direct somebody to undertake that journey, so it needs quite a lot of it's a very straight narrative. You want to get them from A to B, the listener from A to B, and you need to give them all the stages to do that. Okay, that's stage one. And then try repeating this, seeing how few instructions you can use to still get your listener to the destination. So what we're doing here is paring down to the key messages. Fabulous structuring exercise. Now stage three is to add the colour. Keep those key messages, use the fewest possible instructions you can use to get them from A to B, or A to Z, but add in some interesting features that they might see along the way, like descriptions. What wonderful buildings might there be? What's the countryside like? Or maybe experiences they would have, people they might meet, or things that might happen to them. And that's the colour of the journey. The basic structure and the colour. Okay? Another way of thinking about structure with colour is this rather lovely exercise that I use a lot with my clients. So in pairs, you get one of them to tell the other a story, just a true story that they've experienced. It can be really simple and it doesn't need to be structured. That's not the job of the teller. And then the listener says, let's say this is Henry telling me a story. Okay, and I say back, I'll say, okay, Henry told me about this, and I'm giving a title to his story. And then I say, and the first picture I have from Henry's story is this. And whatever picture I saw, I describe. And then I do that a second time. And then I do that a third time. So I am making Henry's story into 3 pictures. So I've given it a title. It's now in 3 chapters, but those chapters are images. And then the conclusion is, and what I learned about Henry through this story is this. And again, my clients find that that immediate way of making the chapters stories or images in themselves can sometimes be a revelation to them. Oh my God, I can create pictures. It's easy. All I have to do is listen. And the person who told the story gets a whole different version of it with a structure now on it. And they have a title, and they have a conclusion. They have, what are we taking away from this? Okay. Now then, let's have a think about some activities that are there for listening and flexibility and confidence building through being spontaneous. Mostly these are about using what you're giving and letting go and having fun, really. Okay. So, accepting and building stories. These are all pretty straightforward. So in group creating stories, when we're accepting, one great structure is yes and. Okay, and that's all we're doing, is that we are giving a topic to the group. The first person, let's say in a circle, makes a statement to start the story off, and after that they get one sentence each, and each sentence begins with yes and it builds from what this person said before. And the trick here is to spot if your students are blocking the offer, if they're changing the story without there being any sense to that, if they're messing with the narrative. So yes and. Every sentence must build on the sentence before, and it's a wonderful listening and accepting exercise. And another version of that is to repeat part of what the person telling the story said before, the final phrase, and to build the next sentence on that. So let's see, I'm going to make something up now. So this is a story about Pat. So if I say, yes, and Pat went to the shops and Pat bought a huge tin of beans, then the next person needs to say, yes, he bought a tin of beans and he took the tin of beans to his fishing trip. So we always have part of the story before in the story that goes after it. One-word stories are simply getting the group to build a story one word at a time, as it would suggest. A conducted narrative is where somebody, basically, you get them into a group and you point at different people within the group, and they keep speaking until you stop pointing at them, and then you point at somebody else. So they never know how long they're going to speak for until it moves on to the next person. Somebody is in control of that. They're the conductor of the group. Oh, yes, and in conductive narrative, actually, you could also, here at this point, split the group into the people who are doing the narrative of the story, as in colour advance, and a group who are providing the colour, advance and colour, and conduct the story between them. So this is moving the story on, this is giving a bit more detail. Okay, group, you move the story on now, you give a bit more detail. Finally, another suggestion is an activity called String of Pearls, which is where you have, let's say, a team of 6. One of them, and we give them a topic, a place for the story to take place and a character, and one person tells one sentence in the story that pertains to the very, very early in the story. So you have one sentence, and this is the beginning of the story. And then the next person up says something that's very near the end of the story. And then the next person up says something that would be in the middle between those two. And each time you repeat what you have. So we've started with a sentence at the beginning, and then we have a sentence at the beginning and at the end, and then we have a sentence at the beginning and then the middle and the end, and we build in within the group the things that link that story together, and we're just inventing it as we go along. But we soon find where the gaps are, and we soon find if we need a more satisfying ending, and then somebody needs to go and provide that. And I've had groups have tremendous fun with that exercise. So again, if you need any clarification on any of these instructions, feel free to ask. Solo or pair stories. Find an object. Any object, get people to chuck objects into the middle of the room. Just go and pick one up and make up the story of that object. So let's say I've picked up this glass of water here. Can you see it? Okay. My job is now to tell the story of this glass of water. Well, you see, this glass of water came from Egyptian times. It's had many, many journeys in its time, from when it was discovered in Tutankhamun's tomb and how it's arrived now at Macmillan, and so on and so forth. And I will tell those stories. And again, it's free flow. The story of the painting, I'm just going to show you what I might show the group. So I've got a whole bunch of paintings on here, and the storytelling exercise is simply to describe the painting, which is a great colour exercise in itself. Just in detail, what are the colours like? What does it mean to me? What does it evoke for me? And or then to build that into a story based on what I see in that painting. I could choose any one of those, and of course you could provide any paintings you like. Personal stories, stories that have happened to us. And then we can build those into what we hear. So in story exchange, what the group do is they each have a number on a card. A number on a card. And they tell a personal story that has happened to them. And the partner that they're with tells a personal story also that has happened to them. And then they exchange cards. And then they go off with that person's card with their story number on it, and they tell that person's story to somebody else as if it was theirs. Right, this is a bit complicated. I'm going to try that again. We each have a numbered card. That number means that the story I tell is the number of that card. And that story gets passed from person to person as I tell it to Henry, and Henry tells it to Sally, and Sally tells it to Joan. And then at the end, when we've passed on the stories that we hear several times, then they get told back. And the original teller gets the chance to hear how much it's changed along the way, because stories do change along the way. And how much did we tell the story we thought we were telling? And how does it get changed when people tell it to somebody else and tell it to somebody else? Again, it's another lovely, really free flow exercise. And finally, on group stories, Swedish stories, where basically you can have pairs, groups, whatever you want, but you have to incorporate whatever words your colleagues say into your story. So they might start off by saying, okay, you've got to mention peacock and boot. And you start off saying, okay, well, this morning I woke up and put on my boots, and out through the window I saw a peacock in my garden. And then they'll say, okay, now you've got to add, then they'll just chuck in tin of paint. And I'll say, and I decided that peacock wasn't the right colour, so I took a tin of paint and I started to paint it, and so on and so forth. And again, it really means that you have to use what you've got. So, we are nearly on time, I can see that. And there are a whole bunch of things that can help us look and sound confident when we're telling stories. And these are some of the essentials. And basically, if I was going to talk about what I think we need to bring stories to life, it's basically an energized body and voice, and the way that we can practice that, and obviously a body and voice that is helping us tell the story in the way that we want the audience to hear it. So, it normally means that we need to turn the dial up a little bit. It normally means that we need to use more movements than we normally would. And one way of doing that is to start trying to tell stories simply through gesture. Once we've got used to telling them, take our words out and try just telling them through showing it with our bodies and our voices. That we don't want it to be too small. We want it to reach our audience, but we don't want it to overwhelm them. So we're keeping our bodies alive and our voices alive without it needing to be shouty or over-energized. We want them, we need to breathe. Breathing is what supports our voices and allows us to punctuate. So think about really dropping your breath down. And here's a text that you can refer to just to practice with. Start by putting different voices on the tortoise and the hare, and then really look at the punctuation and how that helps you break up the story into chunks and how you re-energize your voice at each point. And I would recommend doing that on any number of texts. Read articles out loud. Read work documents out loud. Practice bringing them to life with your voice, but simple children's stories are a fantastic place to start with that. And everything is a story. Pretty much everything is a story, so use it. Notice the stories. Let go. Have fun telling stories. Share stories with people. There is a huge amount more we could talk about, but I know that we're out of time. So Henry, have we still got time for Q&A if anybody has it? That would be great. Is there anything anybody would like to ask? Anything that you'd like more detail on? Anything that you'd like further explained? I'm not seeing anything coming through just yet, so. Oh, okay, thank you. Can you see anything? Oh, okay, let's go for it. Henry, I can't see it, so where am I looking? Thank you. Sorry guys, just trying to see what's coming in. Yeah, totally. Okay, people, what's happening at the moment is we can't find it.
It's on my screen.
It's on Henry's screen. Yeah, shall we pop over to Henry's screen and have a look, see what's there? Can I use those phones? Back in a sec.
Okay, so. Just
Thank you. Yes, Swedish stories. I can indeed explain again. Nadia. Okay, so what happens is somebody starts, I give my partner, or the group gives somebody a title, okay, and let's say the title is, no, sorry, let's start that again. Not a title, a word to start with, 2 or 3 words to start with. And they have to incorporate those words into the story that they tell. And as soon as they've incorporated things, you give them another word, and then another word, and another word. So it just means they keep using what they're given. And it's very freeing exercise, because it means they can't plan. How do you work out the copyright thing when you use other authors' stories? As far as I know, if you're using stories for classrooms, there isn't a copyright issue. Would that be Henry agrees with me there. We don't think there's a copyright issue in class. Mira, he overtakes the flow. What does that mean? Okay, don't know. Is there anybody? Would also like to ask about tech tools useful for storytelling. You know, Storybird for kids, any apps? Don't know about tech tools? Ailey? Henry, do you know anything about tech tools?
Yes, there's a few. We can tell you about those maybe after more detail. I've got some colleagues also listening in who might be able to tell you about some that we do. So maybe stay logged in and we'll go over those at the end.
The 6-word story, yeah, really simple. It is exactly what it says. It's think about, try and write a story using only 6 words. That's it. And I think go back to the Hemingway slide, because that is the best example that I've ever come across, and it's the one that gets quoted all the time. And actually, if you go online, there are probably, I've got a fair idea, there are a few blogs that use 6-word stories as well. So go there for more examples. Anything else, anybody? Cool. Are there any authors or stories that you would not recommend reading at the lesson? I reckon you would probably be able to gauge that as well as I would. No, not unless they're offensive or inappropriate. Okay, role of technology, I think we've just addressed that. Yay, look at that, www.6wordstories.net. Very good. I mean, something that didn't work well. No, not so far. I don't have examples of things that didn't work well. Okay, guys, I think we're probably done. So have fun with it. Really, I cannot say enough how I'm confident that your students will get loads and loads. But keep making the links back to work, okay? Why is this relevant for work? Because they are still real people listening to you at work. They're human beings and they love stories. Okay, thanks very much. Bye, guys.
Okay. Thank you, Carol, for a very engaging session.
Very welcome.
Creating, adapting, and performing stories with young learners. I'm assuming that most of you here have young learners, but those of you who haven't, you're welcome too, because most of the stuff that we're going to talk about today has an application for all learners. But we're specifically looking at young learners today. Some people have a kindergarten, perfect, yes. Hello from New York, wonderful. I think hello is the best term because it all depends on your time zones, but it's afternoon here and it's sunny, in case people are interested, to dispel the myth, the story that it's always cloudy in the UK. It isn't. It's actually delicious weather today. Hello from Greece. Hello there. Good to hear you. Now, let's talk a little bit about who I am. Mike Dodsworth. I'm a professional storyteller, so it's something I do for a job. I'm very lucky to have this job. I feel every time I face an audience, wherever I am, either in the UK or in a different country, I just feel that I'm doing the job that I feel I should be. And I hope as educators yourselves, you feel the same way too. It's a vocation, isn't it, everyone? It's something we're passionate about doing. In this sense, I'm a specialist. I'm not an English language teacher. That's not my area of expertise. I specialize as a storyteller, which means that I will work as an entertainer in the big wide world, in theatres and places of performance where people are expecting to be entertained. But the skills of storytelling also transfer beautifully to education. In fact, storytelling in its form as an entertainment and as an educating tool are very, very intertwined. They're hardly distinguishable. We have a website if you want to keep in touch with me and my travels, and an email address if you wanted to also keep in touch with any more questions, or maybe even tell me a little bit about how storytelling is going in your work. That would be lovely to hear from you. There'll be an opportunity on the last slide to see my details again. But and of course, those who are listening, viewing this as a recording, welcome to you, and you'll have those details in front of you too. Now then, what are you going to gain from this? Well, a whole range of things. I think the main one today is to infuse you to use storytelling in your classrooms and your places of education, but also to give you permission to use it. It sounds a little convoluted, doesn't it? A bit highfalutin to say, I give you permission. But very much, in very many cases, that's exactly what is needed. Someone to say, it's okay. Use storytelling, or use this technique. And people say, oh, well, that's good. And we're all together now. How many of us? We're 194 of us together. Let's all give ourselves permission now to use storytelling while we teach. The emphasis today is going to talk a little bit about the teacher as storyteller, but the emphasis today is really about how you can tell a story or use storytelling or create stories together with your classes, with your learners, and how to then be creative in the classroom and bring the literacy to life, and effectively to get all your learners thinking in English with enthusiasm whilst they're storytelling. So, on we go. Everybody ready? Let's begin. Storytelling. Yeah. What is storytelling, and actually, why should we use it? I've got a beautiful little quote, which I'm sure those of you who are looking at it are beginning to digest already, but I'm going to read it out to you because there's something about being read something or being told something in a clear way that just seems to transmit a little bit deeper than reading sometimes. This is a quote from a storyteller and a blogger, which is another form of storytelling, wouldn't we agree? We storytell in many ways every day, either in a live situation or using technology. Nora had a little think about storytelling, and she came up with these words. Yes, a beautiful quote. You preempted me. Wonderful, Sylvia. Here we are. Storytelling is a human birthright and as natural as breathing. When practiced as an art, storytelling is deeper than philosophy and more fun than the movies. Story is an amazing educational activity because it works on so many levels. It is metacognition, or the natural format of human thought, because it engages physically, emotionally, and intellectually. Storytelling is deeply satisfying entertainment. Since the listeners work with the performer and have a shared active experience, storytelling is also a social tool that can help build healthy community. As a performance art, storytelling is spoken word at its most accessible. As a timeless and essentially human art, storytelling delights, engages, and inspires students of all ages and abilities. I hope you completely agree, Nadia. Well, thank you for that. I think the argument is very strong that storytelling is as old as we are and something that we essentially do naturally, like breathing, and it transmits on so many levels. And it can be used to communicate on in so many degrees. There's some full agreement. Anyone disagree? Well, at the moment we've got mostly people agreeing with that statement. But I think Nora has come up with a very, very convincing argument. So thank you, Nora. That's wonderful. You can keep in touch with Nora and her blog spot. It's a couple of years old, this particular quote. Well, a few, but I think it still resonates today. And someone thinks storytelling and making music together are the oldest forms of entertainment. Yes, I think storytelling, dance, music, these forms would have all have emerged at the same time, something we all essentially do. Music tells a story, so does dance. Absolutely, I agree. Wonderful. Now, critical thinking. Storytelling raises key questions. Absolutely. Storytelling communicates on all of these levels. It engages the listener to begin to think and imagine and feel and sense and remember and assess and question and challenge. And the storyteller is almost sometimes subliminally asking these questions of an audience. But more often than not, they're letting the story speak for itself. And as we know, stories work on many, many levels, depending on who's telling it, how it's told, who's listening, and all of these qualities. Who, what, when, where, why, how. You can even create a story by just answering these questions. You can make one up on the spot. You can have a little go yourselves if you like, but let's challenge myself, and I haven't prepared this, but let's have a little look at these questions, and I'll make a quick story up. This is an exercise. This is probably our first one. Who? A clown, what? Stepped out into the circus ring, when? During the second performance of the day. Where? The circus had arrived at a kingdom with many mountains. Why? The circus traveled in order to reach as many people as possible and to make its living. How? The clown performed brilliantly And all of the people of the kingdom of the mountain clapped and laughed, and all of the children in the audience remembered the clown and his performance forever and ever and ever. So there we go. I've just improvised a story based on these questions. And already I'm getting some responses. Very nice, awesome, great. But I wonder how the story made you feel. And I wonder if, give yourselves a few moments, you could also do the same. Already I'm demonstrating just how accessible storytelling is, just by allowing yourself to go for it, giving yourself permission to try. Okay, let's move on. This story made you feel enchanted and interested, Fern from Germany. Wonderful, that's a really good reaction. Curious from some, yes, it should be. It should be making us feel and sense things, and we should be getting to see pictures in our heads and visualizing and imagining what might happen next. It might remind us of certain things we've seen. Already we can see how storytelling is beginning to actually give us that sense of being able to think critically. Now, let's move on to actually using storytelling in the classroom. I think that there's some very nice comments about voice and the way I told the story came across. Absolutely, it is a skill and an art form, but it's something that you can do. In fact, I would argue that anybody can tell a story. It may not be everyone's thing, everyone's preference, something they feel they're particularly good at, but I think if pressed, anyone and everyone can have a go. And I'm going to try and urge you now to say, well, I'm going to tell a story to my class. I'm going to use storytelling on a regular basis in order to enrich language teaching, introduce new words, introduce grammar, introduce the idea of critical thinking, introduce the idea of your students visualizing as a response to the English that you're using in your stories. Your stories could be made up. Your stories could be something that you've researched. But you need to actually take the step of deciding for yourself, in response to my infusing, to actually lead from the front and decide to stand up in front of your class or sit down, depends on your preference, and tell a story. Once you've started, you won't stop. You'll be able to use it at any given moment because storytelling is so flexible and requires very little resource. You can tell a story at any given moment. It can be told quickly, slowly. You can repeat the story as many times as you like. Over a period of a year, if you like, you could tell the same story on a regular basis. It may change as time goes on. And the audience will anticipate. This is your class, the audience. I think it's important now for us to begin to think in terms of performer and audience and the relationship between the two. I would argue that a teacher and a class has the same dynamic, the performer and the audience. What we're going to look at today is a way of trying to combine those two. And after giving yourself permission to be the performer, to be the storyteller, you then hand over permission to your audience to then step up and become the storyteller, become the audience. So there's a switch, there's a relationship, a flow between the two of you. But it's all about permission. If you role model initially for your class, for your learners, it will encourage them to think, oh, this is working. I'm enjoying this. Maybe this is something that I could do as well, or we could do, if they're thinking collectively as a class. But what stories do you tell? Well, there's a world of stories to choose from, isn't there? It could be something that comes from your culture. It could be something that is extremely well known globally. It could be something that you create from your own head, from your own imagination. But I would argue if you're going to do something creative like storytelling, use the rule of the starting point. And by this I mean, when you're thinking about how do I start something, how do I start creating something, and all artists of all art forms are in this position very, very often. How do I begin? Well, the biggest thing you need to do there, and the most important concept to grasp, is do something that interests you. And then you think, oh, that's very simple. Yes, it is. Simple is good, particularly when you're starting. Choose to do something that interests you. So if we then transfer that to what story do I tell, it's the same question. Well, tell a story that you like, that you're interested in, that you feel something for. Make a choice that means something to you, because that sense of the story meaning something to you will transmit to the audience. Already, the battle will have been won. Okay? Which stories to choose? Well, choose one you like, a favorite. Yeah, something you may have found that you've not read before or heard before, but suddenly you think, well, I like that. I'd like to tell that. Yeah, a bit like telling stories to your children at bedtime. Something that you can repeat and over again. Something you love. All of these qualities shine through. And how do you tell a story? Well, there are many ways of doing it. Obviously, using your voice, and never tell a story to an audience without having spoken the story out loud before you've even faced the audience. Because it's very different thinking of a story in your head, a bit like when we read text to ourselves, when reading a book or reading a piece of text. It could be something on our phones or our technology, an email or something. We have a sort of internal monologue, don't we? That internal monologue, that idea of letting text roll around in your head, there may be a voice to it, is very different to actually speaking text and speaking a story. Because as soon as you open your mouth and start to speak, many other factors can become obstacles. You can trip over your words, you can forget what you were saying. It's very important to actually speak a story out loud before you face an audience. You could do this in front of a mirror if you like. Or you could have the support of a colleague, if you have that luxury, to actually speak the story to them and tell them the story before you face your learners. I do encounter, when I'm training teachers how to be storytellers practically in a workshop situation, they feel quite comfortable telling a story in front of children, they say, but they feel quite uncomfortable telling a story to adults and to colleagues. But I think I've encountered both, but more often than not, teachers find it more difficult to tell a story to an adult. So facing your learners with a story will be much like telling your children, if your parents, stories. It feels very natural. It actually accentuates your own professional persona as an educator. It feels very, very normal to be telling a story to the children. But how you tell a story? Well, put some energy into it, put some expression into your voice, put some expression into your face, use good timing, build up suspense. These are all tips and tricks that you can even catch on the Macmillan website, and you may see me on video shortly, coming over the next few months, giving some tips and tricks on how to tell stories. You're probably pretty good at it already yourselves. You may even have some brilliant storytellers out there already. But the main thing to think about is, how am I coming across to my learners? You must be yourself as much as you can, with just a little bit more energy, a bit larger. Bring your personality into it. Be yourself, but bigger. Yeah? And the rest will flow. And then the more you do, the more you practice, the more you repeat a story, the better you get at it. It's just the way it works. It's a natural progression. But first and foremost, give yourself permission. Okay, give yourself permission now. Give each other permission. Yeah, all 209 of us. Permit yourselves, permit each other to role model as a storyteller. Yeah. Start from the front. Be the first to do it. And in that way, we can then move on to thinking about how we can permit and enable our learners to become storytellers too. Okay? Fine. Let's move on. 13 to 17-year-olds, is it useful to tell them stories? Yes, I think it is extremely useful to tell stories, Larissa, to older children and older learners. Effectively, a storyteller faces an audience, in my situation usually, where an audience may be comprised of very young children, babies, and people in their 80s or 90s, and any age in between, and a storyteller can tell the same story to all people of all ages, and it will still resonate with each one of those age groups. So we can dispel the idea of stories not being appropriate in terms of the act of storytelling to the different age groups. It's all about the material, isn't it then? I mean, what text, what story is appropriate for the age groups? What sort of language should I be using? You scale up and down as necessary. Yeah? Good. Yeah. This is interesting. Let's consider the idea of the classroom as your place to tell a story. It's the place where your audience is gathering, the place where you as the storyteller are going to tell your story. It has to be a safe place, a place of trust. You need to create trust with your learners as storyteller in order to then hand over to them and say, look, it's safe to do this. We're all doing this. We all feel safe doing this. No one feels particularly silly. Yes, it might be something that's unusual for some, but it's something we can all do. And everyone feels safe within the classroom. Storytelling. This takes a little bit of time to build. As we know, trust is won slowly. Wouldn't you agree? But this is something you will have time to do with your learners. Slowly but surely. You may find that your learners run with the idea of storytelling very, very quickly. For others, it may take a little bit more time. But building an atmosphere of trust which allows people permission to do, permission to express themselves, permission to be creative. The place to tell and listen to stories is the classroom. There's a definite... Are there sound problems? I cannot hear a thing. That's Cecilia who can't hear. Let's see if anyone else has the same opinion. Can everyone else hear? Or would you like me to adjust the microphone? Nadia has recommended turning up volume a little bit, which I can. Others have recommended headphones. Everyone else is fine. Perhaps it's your audio wizard hasn't been set up on your interface. So you can go through the audio wizard in order to then hear. Okay, wonderful. So we were talking about the classroom being the place to tell. Yes, I think once trust is established and everyone is feeling this is our place to tell stories, it's something we can look forward to, it's a place where this will happen on a regular basis, it creates that sense of vibrancy, a vibrant creative atmosphere, particularly when you've started creating stories together and sharing them with each other. Now that's very important. Once a story is created, it needs to be shared, it needs to be told. Yeah? It only works when it's told and received. It's a give and take between audience and storyteller. Okay? Building up trust is achieved by repetition, by you role modeling and smiling and being energetic and telling everyone it's fine. Okay, it's something we can all do. We all feel safe. Yeah. And only then can you hand over and give permission to your learners to actually have a go themselves. Once that trust is established. Okay. Let's move on to the idea of storytelling together. Let us assume that you've told some stories as the storyteller facing the learners as your audience. And now it's time to try and introduce the idea of your learners telling stories too. Now, you wouldn't hand over immediately and point at a learner and say, now it's your turn, stand up and tell a story. That would be too soon, too sudden. We need to build up to that sense of that happening, if it ever happens, by working together as a group, as an equal unit. Okay, this works particularly well with young learners, but it also works well with older learners too. Going back to that idea of would 13 to 17-year-olds also enjoy this sort of work? Yes, they would. The way in, particularly with young learners, is to play games. Wouldn't we all agree? Games are where we learn initially when we're very, very young. And the idea, of course, folks, is keep playing games as an adult too. In fact, keep playing games all of your life and keep learning. There's one game, Whispers, which is a lovely introductory game to storytelling. Okay, it's a game you can play in a circle. If you have the luxury of being able to move your furniture away in your classrooms, in your learning spaces, then more's the better. People can all sit down in a circle. But it's also a game that can be played in a line, if you wish, or if people are in close proximity together, it can be done in your normal classroom setup. But the idea of Whispers, one person starts, and it could be you as the role modeler, and they have to think of something they're going to say, a short phrase, maybe a very mini story, a sentence. It may even be a few words, something that you're learning, something that may have been introduced quite recently in the classroom, and they have to whisper it into the ear of the next person. You then have to whisper it to the next person, and then so on and so forth, until it's whispered around the room, and it returns to the person who started the whisper, which would be you, for example. Then you have to say what you've just heard, what's just been whispered into your ear. And more often than not in this game, because people are people, and games and rules can be bent, it's changed between what you first said and what then you hear at the end. It's fun. Everyone enjoys that game. Sometimes the story or the phrase can go all the way around the room, all the way around the circle, and remain intact, unchanged. But more often than not, it changes. And this automatically gives the learners the idea that, yes, Chinese Whispers, it's known as, you've played that game before, you call it telephone in the States. Yeah, that's right. I remember working with some people from the States who called it telephone. Yeah, it's a great way of, yes, exactly. It's a great way of getting people laughing, relaxed. It's a good warm-up to storytelling. Oh, and also, people have begun to listen and speak, for speaking and listening are the key techniques in storytelling. Storyteller, audience, speaking, listening. Yeah. You can play that over and over again. Broken phone, that's some people's, yes, indeed. But this Whispers game is also a metaphor for stories themselves, how stories travel across the world, how they're told from one person to the next, and how they can evolve. It's a metaphor for how flexible storytelling is. It doesn't mean that a story that you've heard has to remain the same. It can be adapted. It can be changed. It must change. It must adapt. Of course, as the story travels around the world, as the whisper travels through the room, it's being processed by different people, by different individuals. It's called it's a broken telephone in Spanish. Yeah, it is a fun game. Try it. Try it as a warm-up to encourage speaking and listening. Should we do it with words per story? Yes, you could. You could do it, but it could be absolutely anything at this point. But yes, you can choose whatever words you think are right for the time. It's that flexible. It's up to you to decide. You can then obviously get other people to start the game. So one of your learners might want to come up with a phrase in English to start the game. It's beginning to actually introduce the idea of this game of learners standing up, separating themselves from everyone else, coming up with an original phrase that's come from them, and then they start the game. And when it comes back to them, how wonderful they feel that they'd started the game. It was their phrase, their piece of English that started and made everyone laugh and have a good time. Okay. Let's move on. Story Circle. This is a game, again, that can be best played in a circle, because circles are good because you can see everyone at the same time. Yeah. So you're all together in that safe place I was talking about, creating a story together. You, again, as role modeler, can begin this particular game, almost moderate the game, the story game. You start with a story starter. For example, it may be one snowy day, or once upon a time, or in the jungle. One person starts with a story starter, and then they pass it on to the person sitting next to them, who builds the story, adds to it. And then the person next to them will say something and build the story, and so on and so forth, until the story goes all the way around the circle, and it goes on and on and on until you decide to end it, until the story fizzles out by itself. But if a learner doesn't want to contribute in the circle, that's fine. They may not feel confident. They just pass it on to the next person. Yeah. But in this way, your stronger speakers will role model for the ones who are feeling less confident. And if you keep going with that game, more and more people get into the idea of it working and not feeling threatened by the game. I've got a point here. Fine. I'll come back to that about peer collaboration. But this is effectively what we're talking about here. You're working together to create a story in a very safe way. Yeah. You can use pictures as starters, absolutely. You can use puppets as a story starter. The puppet could be passed. You can use objects to help with the story. However you start the story and what it's about is entirely up to you. Yes, you must try this with your timid intermediate speakers, because this is a good chance for those intermediate speakers who are feeling timid to feel safe and actually try out their English. Yeah? Good. Memory Circle is a challenging game, only because you have to remember what everyone has said before you. And this game can break down into laughter as well, and start again, or can be picked up, or the group can actually pick this game up and say, no, you forgot this bit. Shall I explain? Memory Circle is a bit like Story Circle, but you actually have to remember everything that the person before you and the one before them, in fact, right up to the beginning, has said, and you have to say it out loud. Memory Circle could work like this. The story starter, the role modeler, whoever's beginning the game, could say something like, maybe it's a good vocabulary game, so it could be something like shopping, or, yeah, let's try shopping. I went to the shops and I bought a tomato. That's the story starting. It then gets passed to the next person, who then has to say, I went to the shops and I bought a tomato and a cucumber. And then the third person has to add to that shopping list and say, I went to the shops and I bought a tomato, a cucumber, and a pepper. And then can you see how it builds, and however big your group is, so there are 20 learners, the last person, which in this case could be you, the one who started, is the last one to speak. And you will have had to have remembered everything that everyone has said in that list. What a rich way of introducing vocabulary, revising vocabulary, and also grammar too, because you can challenge yourselves to say more than just one word. It's a really great way of a group storytelling together, having a common experience, feeling safe, and challenging their use of language. Okay. If the students forget the story, so it gets to a student that has forgotten the list, well then the group can then come to their aid, come to their help, and you can remember together what the list was. Yeah. So you're not actually singling someone out as having forgotten. You help them. Yeah. You assist them to remember. And in that way, everyone's in this together. Does that make sense to everyone? Well, if you change the story, that's fine. People have to be listening. You can use actions to help them remember. Yes. Every technique that you use as a teacher, you can invest into these storytelling games. Now, time is pressing, but the A-B game is for more advanced speakers. But the concept of this is one where you're actually beginning to hand over a bit more permission for the learners to be standing by themselves as storytellers. You can divide your learners into small groups, or into pairs, or into threes, and this game is about them building a story together. Okay. A starts with a story starter, such as, I looked out of the window this morning and I saw a blue elephant, for example. B then has to say something else that builds the story, and the blue elephant was smiling, was happy. And then A, if the students lack the vocabulary, then of course you have to simplify and adapt, depending on their level. Okay. But remember, this is a more advanced story. It could be revision too. It could be reiterating grammar and vocabulary that you've already used, say in role-playing or in other forms. But the learners build the story together, and then you ask them to swap parts and remember the opposite person's part of the story. So the learners learn both sides of the story, and then you get them to revise that story so that both of them, or the three of them in the group, or all of them in the small group, know the story. Then you split them up, and they can wander off and find a different learner who's been in a different group and tell that learner the entire story. And the learner they've just met will tell them the story they just created. And it becomes a game where you've learnt the story together and created it, you then split up having learnt it, find someone else to tell it to, and all of a sudden you have a room of learners telling stories to each other. Individual creative stories that are original and have been created that very day. And then those stories start to change. The individual storyteller, the learner who's now become storyteller, begins to adapt the story and use their own language, their own style, their own gestures, their own feelings, their own expressions. And you might ask one of those learners to stand up in front of everyone and tell the story they've just created and practiced and told to many, many people. And that learner suddenly stands as if they're 10 feet tall and feels that power that the storytelling can give them and make them feel something. They're facing an audience, yes. It's a way of building your learners up from audience to storyteller. Okay. It's quite fun to try this one now, but I think we probably don't have enough time. But maybe that's something we could do on the live Twitter later on, where I could do a story starter and you can throw stuff back at me. We can build one together. Or a bit like the story circle game as well. Let's give it a go. But yes, it will very much depend on the level of language your students and learners can use and how much intervening you have to do to help them. Okay, fine. Aim high, everyone. Once the learners have got the idea of being storytellers, the sky is the limit. And if you do this regularly with them, their storytelling becomes more and more fluent. Their use of language becomes more and more fluent. Their critical thinking becomes more and more acute. You can bring in stories from books, and you can role model those stories. And then once your learners are used to this whole process of the safe, trusting place where they're allowed to storytell, you can get them to go off and create their own versions of the stories that you role model. You may have read out a story to them. They may have drawn a picture too to help them. There are all sorts of ways. But they can then perform stories to each other and share them. Yes, share them with each other. Tell the stories to each other. Yeah, perform. Yeah, they don't have to work alone. They can be working in pairs, in groups. Whatever they think. There'll be brave ones who want to work solo. Okay, festival stories. Yes, indeed, celebrate the stories. Make sure that you give platform and time for the stories to be told, and in that safe place that you've created. Okay? Aim high, regular storytelling, celebrate the stories, applaud each other, congratulate each other. Yes? There's nothing worse for a performer who's worked really hard and told a good story, for example, and the audience doesn't applaud them or give them some form of congratulation. Yeah? It is difficult with big groups, but you can break a big group down into smaller groups, and it's about you circulating and making sure that everyone's on task. But I appreciate that big groups are difficult. You'll be using a lot of energy yourself as the moderator, as the role model figure. But some groups will be quite independent and work by themselves quite happily. Other groups, smaller groups within the big group, will struggle. But you as your teacher know your learners, and you'll know pretty much which ones are going to fly and which ones will need a little bit more support. Yeah? Okay. Sharing and showing. So the idea of performing your stories to each other after you've created them and adapted them and got used to the act of storytelling itself. Share the stories with each other. The idea of sharing is quite informal. By sharing, I mean sharing amongst yourselves within that safe place, you and your learners. Showing your stories would indicate that you could, once you're happy with them and permission has been given, you can show them to those who haven't been involved in that safe space. People from the outside, people you invite to come in and enjoy your stories in English. So that could be the carers of your learners. It could be other teachers, other learners within your educational within the school or the centre that you work in. Showing indicates something a bit more formal, something that you're setting up, that you're inviting an outside audience into your space to then share your stories with them. Because if you're proud of your work, after having shared them with each other, show them. Why not? It's all part of that sense of celebrating. Yeah? But as this whole process unfolds, as you get more and more involved with storytelling in your learners, teach them how to be a good audience. Yeah? And a good audience is one that listens. A good audience is one that shows the sort of respect that they would expect to receive when it's their turn to perform. Yeah? A good audience is one that listens and respects. And a good performer is one that is thinking about the audience at all times. Encourage your learners, as storytellers, to gain the attention of their audience, to be energetic, to tell clear stories. A good story is a clear one. Yeah? Tell them to use their personalities. It'll help with that energy. Yeah? But remember, it's about the audience. It's not necessarily about you. Okay? Always think of your audience. Now, audience shapes. Very briefly, this is quite advanced theatre theory, and it's something that the theatre world uses, is that sense of putting your audience into different shapes for different reasons. Now, energy and choose a clear story. Thank you for reiterating that sense of, or agreeing that energy and clarity are good qualities of being a good performer. I happen to agree with that thoroughly. We've already mentioned putting our audience into a circle, haven't we? It works really well because you can see everyone, everyone feels equal. The storyteller might stand up in the circle and suddenly they have changed their status. Yeah? The storyteller might also go into the middle of the circle and work in there. The storyteller can bring volunteers into the middle of the circle and get the volunteers to help them tell the story and role play. A circle's a wonderful audience shape for storytelling. But also a semicircle's a good shape too, for the storyteller to stand in front of a semicircle. Yeah. So it's very warm, a very energetic space, a semicircle. And you can have many rows in the semicircle as well. It's a bit like, if you think about ancient Greek theatre, it was a semicircle shape. A corner depends on where your where you place yourself with your learners. You may automatically be in a corner. I know a lot of primary schools in the UK, the teacher's desk is in a corner, and from that corner they can actually look at the whole room. And you could tell a story from a corner. Works very well, putting your audience in front of you, cornering you in. It may seem that it may feel a bit threatening being cornered, but it's actually a very powerful place for a storyteller to be. You can stand on a chair if you want to raise your status, or you can just simply sit on a chair in the corner. And your audience only looks at you, and there you are as the storyteller, at the center of everything in a corner. End on is actually a theatre term for you on a stage in front of a big block of audience. Yeah? So there you are on the stage, and there's the audience on the other side in rows. Some classes are set up that way, aren't they? They're naturally end on. But if you're going to storytell when it's end on, you must encourage, well, by role modeling and getting your learners too, to be very big and very energetic when it's end on. Otherwise, people at the back won't be able to see or hear or feel. Okay? So end on. Some classes might naturally be set up that way for storytelling. Traverse is quite an interesting shape. I hope I'm not losing everyone on this particular theatre theory, but it works very well for storytelling. If you think of parallel lines, one side of your audience is in one line, the other is on the other line, and they can see each other, and there's a space in between where the storyteller can move and walk or position themselves at either end between the parallel lines. It's good because the audience can actually watch each other's reactions as well as watching and listening to the storyteller. It's very interactive, a traverse shape. Okay? Learners trapped in the corner, someone's concerned. Yes, of course, there might be a concern about feeling trapped in a corner. But don't worry, you can soon, if you're storytelling, you're taking control, you're the one telling the story, you can reverse that power and feel that you're not trapped, but you're just being watched and listened to. Yeah? Yes, it's a good idea to have a traverse shape. Try it. It's experimental. Well, if you feel it's like a trap, then don't use a corner. I think that's probably, use your preference. You can choose and adapt. The last one, promenade, which of course is a French word for walking effectively. Promenade is that sense of a storyteller or a performer just walking around the audience in whatever shape they're in. They might be sitting at desks, they might be on chairs, and telling your story here, there, and everywhere. Promenade. You have the freedom to go wherever you like, as long as people can hear you, and you're communicating the story, and you're using that sense of energy. Promenade is a lovely way of telling a story. It's very relaxed, nice for sharing. Yeah? For showing, it's a bit more challenging, but for sharing a story, just tell a story wherever you are. Okay? It's that flexible. Wonderful. Okay. We've come to the end of our time together, and I wish I had a lot more time, and time has flown. But of course, why don't we try something on Twitter? We're going to have a Twitter chat, which have a storytelling theme, and perhaps it would be exciting if we could do a series of things. I wonder if anyone could tell a story on a tweet with exactly 140 characters, including spaces. Okay, I'm going to have a go myself. I have pre-prepared one, I have to admit. And maybe we could play a game of storytelling as well and bounce stories off each other to see what we can come up with by the end of our time together. Maybe a 15, 20-minute session for a Twitter chat would be fun. Let's challenge ourselves within that time to see how much we can do. Either tell a story with 140 characters or less, okay, including spaces. Or let's try and create some stories together, and hopefully I'll be responding to those and throwing in some tips and tricks as well. Well, thank you so much for joining me. I've really enjoyed my time, and I hope you did too. And I hope that that permission to storytell has transferred to you, and you transfer that to your learners. Happy storytelling, and do keep in touch and let me know all of your news and how you're getting on. Thank you ever so much indeed. Bye-bye now.